In the hushed cathedral of Boston's culinary elite, the Meridian, some names were sacraments, others were curses. One name was both: Isolde Blackwood. She was not merely a millionaire's wife. She was the wife of Alistair Blackwood, a man whose tech fortune was so vast it had begun to warp the very gravity of the city's old money establishment. Isolde's cruelty, however, was a currency all its own, minted in public humiliations and spent on the careers of those who displeased her. For a decade, she had ruled the Meridian's corner booth, Table 1, as an empress on a velvet throne, a flawless monster in a kingdom of crystal and starlight. But all empires, especially those built on fear, have a fragile foundation. They are elaborate forgeries, waiting for the eye of a true expert. And what happens when the new waitress, a quiet, unassuming woman with the eyes of a hawk and a past she thought was buried, begins to see the cracks in the masterpiece? This is not a story of simple revenge. It is the story of a careful, methodical authentication, the quiet unmasking of a fake, one perfectly served course at a time. The air inside the Meridian smelled of inherited wealth. It was a layered, complex aroma, a base note of the centuries-old mahogany paneling, a heart of expensive floral arrangements, and the faintest hint of beeswax, and a top note of the crisp, cold scent of power. For Eleanor Vance, it was the smell of rock bottom. Just 6 months ago, she had been Ellie Vance, junior partner at Vance & Son, appraisers of fine art and antiquities. Her life had been one of loops and ledgers, of tracing the provenance of Georgian silver and spotting the subtle tells of a masterful forgery. Her father had taught her everything. He'd taught her that every object tells a story, and that the most convincing fakes always betray themselves with a single, tiny anachronism. A tool mark that didn't exist in the period, a chemical in the pigment that was invented a century too late. Then a bad investment, a soured economy, and her father's failing health had brought the venerable family business crashing down. The polished sign on their Newbury Street door was replaced by a bank notice, and Ellie's world of quiet expertise evaporated. Now, she was adjusting the starched collar of a uniform that felt more like a costume. Her first week was a masterclass in a different kind of precision. Wine glasses were to be polished until they were invisible. Water was to be poured silently, a continuous stream that never touched the rim. A guest's napkin, if dropped, was to be replaced with a fresh one from a silver tray before the original had even settled on the Persian rug. The most critical rule, however, was not in the leather-bound employee manual. It was delivered by Marcus, the head bartender, a man whose face was a testament to 30 years of observing the city's powerful at their most unguarded. He was meticulously arranging orange twists on a linen cloth, his movements as economical as a watchmaker's. "You see Table 1?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble, nodding toward the corner booth that sat like a royal box overlooking the dining room. It was currently empty, a silent stage. "That's the lion's den, and the lioness arrives at 8 sharp every Friday." Ellie followed his gaze. The booth was upholstered in deep sapphire velvet, commanding a perfect view of every entrance and exit. "The lioness?" "Isolde Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice dropping. He placed a finished twist into a crystal dish. "Wife of Alistair Blackwood. You know, Blackwood Dynamics, the man whose software runs pretty much the entire financial world." Ellie knew the name, of course. Alistair Blackwood was a Boston institution, a scion of an old family who had possessed the genius to pivot their shipping fortune into a technology empire. His wife, Isolde, was a different kind of famous. She was a constant presence in the society pages, a patron of the arts, praised for her impeccable taste and icy, untouchable beauty. Her official biography was a carefully curated masterpiece, born to a distinguished but private European family, educated in Switzerland, a whirlwind romance with the city's most eligible widower. "She's our most important patron," Marcus continued, his eyes doing a practiced sweep of the room. "And our most dangerous. The rules are simple. Don't speak to her unless she speaks to you. Don't make eye contact for more than a second. If she finds a single fingerprint on her wine glass, she won't just complain to the manager. She will try to have you deported, even if you're from Cambridge. I'm not joking." A knot of anxiety tightened in Ellie's stomach. This sounded less like a demanding customer, and more like a psychological predator. "Is she really that terrible?" Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh. "Last year, a new sommelier, a young man from France, very talented, recommended a wine to her. He described its notes as honest and rustic. She took it as an insult. She claimed he was calling her unsophisticated. She made a scene so surgically cruel, so personally demeaning, that the young man quit on the spot, walked out in the middle of service, and flew back to France the next day. She destroyed his confidence in a single sentence. She seemed to feed on it." The story landed like a shard of ice in Ellie's gut. In her old life, she had dealt with arrogant collectors and duplicitous dealers, but this was a different kind of poison, cruelty for sport, performed before an audience. At precisely 8 o'clock, a hush seemed to ripple out from the restaurant's entrance. The host, a perpetually nervous young man named David, looked as if he were about to present a tribute to a volatile deity. Alistair Blackwood was tall and lean, with the quiet, weary posture of a man who carried the world on his shoulders. He wore his inherited elegance, like a well-tailored but uncomfortable suit. But it was Isolde who commanded the room. She was a vision of calculated perfection. Her raven-black hair was pulled into a severe chignon, emphasizing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. A dress of shimmering gunmetal grey clung to her frame, and a single, breathtaking sapphire and diamond brooch was pinned to her shoulder. It was her face, however, that was most arresting. It was a masterpiece of cold beauty, but to Ellie's trained eye, it looked constructed. The smile didn't quite reach the pale, arctic blue of her eyes. Her gaze swept the room, not with curiosity, but with the cold assessment of a queen checking for dissent among her subjects. Ellie felt the staff physically recoil as that gaze passed over them. Ellie's station was 3 tables away from the throne, a proximity that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. For the first hour, she moved through her duties, the familiar rhythm of service calming her nerves. She could hear Isolde's voice, a low, melodic tone that was somehow more cutting than a shout. She didn't need volume. Her power was in her precision. She complained that the single rose in the table's vase was a shade too pink, calling it suburban. She sent back a perfectly clear consommé, claiming she could detect the ghost of a dishwasher's rinse aid. Each complaint was a small, public execution, a reassertion of her absolute authority. Ellie watched, and as she watched, the appraiser in her began to take over. She wasn't just seeing a cruel woman. She was analyzing an object. She observed the way Isolde held her silver, with a grip that was just a fraction too tight, as if she were afraid it might be taken from her. She noticed the way her eyes darted around the room, not with the ease of ownership, but with the constant vigilance of an imposter. And then she saw the ring. It was a stunning piece on Isolde's right hand, a large cabochon emerald, in what appeared to be a 16th century Florentine setting. It was the kind of piece her father would have called important. But as Isolde gestured to the waiter, the light from the chandelier caught the stone. For a split second, Ellie saw it, an unnatural, uniform clarity, a tell. Most emeralds from that period, especially of that size, had natural inclusions, tiny flaws known as a jardin or garden. A stone that clean was either impossibly rare, worth more than the restaurant itself, or it was a modern, lab-created synthetic. The setting, too, seemed just a bit too perfect, its supposed centuries of wear too uniform, too artificially applied. It was a forgery. Ellie was almost certain of it. A magnificent, incredibly expensive one, but a forgery nonetheless. The thought was so jarring, so out of place, that she almost dropped the water pitcher in her hand. Why would the wife of Alistair Blackwood, a woman who could afford any jewel on earth, wear a fake? Unless she didn't know, or worse, unless her entire persona was as fake as the stone on her finger. The real spectacle arrived with the main course. A young busboy, no older than 19, was clearing the adjacent table. He was nervous, his movements jerky. As he reached for a bread plate, his elbow came within inches of Isolde's shoulder. He didn't touch her, but she flinched away as if he had struck her, a small, sharp gasp escaping her lips. "Excuse me," she said. The word sliced through the dining room's ambient murmur. The boy froze, his face draining of all color. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood." "Your proximity," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It is an invasion. The air around you, it's common. I feel as though my meal has been contaminated by your carelessness." She placed her fork and knife on her plate of untouched Dover sole, crossing them with finality. "I've lost my appetite." Alistair Blackwood let out a quiet, tired sigh, a sound so full of resignation it was almost heartbreaking. He said nothing, simply staring at the tablecloth. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage with a beautiful, venomous jaguar. The manager, Mr. Henderson, scurried to the table, his face a mask of mortified apology. He offered to have the chef remake the entire meal. He offered complimentary champagne, dessert, anything. The busboy stood behind him, trembling, looking as if he were about to be sick. Ellie watched the scene unfold, but she wasn't just seeing a bully at work anymore. She was seeing a con artist protecting her mark. The outburst wasn't about hygiene or personal space. It was a performance, a smoke screen. It was the desperate act of someone terrified of being looked at too closely, of being examined, of being found out. Marcus had called this place a lion's den. He was right. And Eleanor Vance, standing in the shadows with a water pitcher in her hand, had just met the lioness. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Ellie had spent her entire life learning how to spot a fake, and she was looking at the most elaborate one she had ever seen. A week later, by a cruel twist of scheduling, Ellie was assigned to Table 1. The regular server for the station had come down with a sudden, violent case of what the staff had grimly dubbed Isolde's revenge. Mr. Henderson had approached Ellie, his expression that of a general sending his last soldier into a hopeless battle. "Vance," he'd said, his voice tense. "You're steady, you're professional, you're on Blackwood tonight." A wave of commiseration rippled through the staff. Marcus caught her eye from behind the bar, giving a minute shake of his head, a silent offer to try and get her reassigned. Ellie simply gave a firm, single nod. "Of course, Mr. Henderson." She prepared for the shift like she was preparing to authenticate a priceless, volatile artifact. She studied the Blackwoods file, memorizing every preference. Isolde took still water from a specific Norwegian spring, served at precisely 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a single, paper-thin slice of cucumber, not lime. She despised the scent of truffle, which meant Ellie had to ensure no dish containing it passed within a 10-foot radius of their table. Alistair drank a specific, rare Japanese whiskey, Suntory Hakushu 18-year, with one large, perfectly clear sphere of ice. Every detail was a potential minefield. When the Blackwoods arrived, Ellie was a study in calm efficiency. She approached the table with a placid, neutral expression. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. My name is Eleanor, and I will be your server this evening." Isolde's Arctic eyes flickered over her, a cold, dismissive appraisal that lasted a second too long. She didn't reply, simply stating, "Norwegian water. Cucumber." "Of course," Ellie replied, her voice even. She executed the initial service with the flawless precision of a surgeon. The water was presented, the whiskey poured, the specific bread selection, only brioche, no sourdough, was placed on the table. For a fleeting moment, Ellie allowed herself to hope she might survive the evening. The illusion was shattered when Isolde ordered the seared foie gras. 10 minutes later, Ellie placed the plate before her. The dish was a work of art, garnished with a fig reduction and toasted pistachios. Isolde stared at it, her expression unreadable. She picked up her fork, prodded the edge of the foie gras, and then set the fork down with a quiet, deliberate click. She looked up, and for the first time that night, her eyes locked directly with Ellie's. "There is a problem with the saucing in your kitchen," she announced. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was pitched to carry to the neighboring tables. Ellie's heart rate quickened, but her training kicked in. Observe, analyze. Do not react. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Blackwood. Is the dish not to your liking?" "The dish is an insult," Isolde replied, her voice laced with theatrical disappointment. "This is grade B foie gras. It lacks the buttery texture and clean finish of a true grade A. It's spongy. Do you and the chef truly believe I wouldn't know the difference?" Ellie knew, with absolute certainty, that it was grade A. She had seen the delivery invoice herself that morning. The Meridian sourced its foie gras from a small, exclusive farm in the Hudson Valley. This was the test. This was the moment she was expected to grovel, to apologize, to panic. It was the opening gambit in Isolde's cruel game. But instead of crumbling, Ellie's mind went into appraisal mode. She saw the minute tension in Isolde's jaw, the way her gaze flickered toward her husband. She wasn't angry about the food. She was performing for an audience of one. She was reinforcing her own narrative of sophisticated expertise. Ellie decided not to play her part in the production. "You have an exceptionally discerning palate, Mrs. Blackwood," Ellie said, her voice a perfect blend of professional deference and unshakable calm. The statement was not an apology. It was an observation. "I will inform the chef of your feedback immediately and have a replacement brought to you." She reached for the plate, but Isolde held up a hand, stopping her. "No. The entire experience has been soured. Just take it away." She turned to her husband. "You see, Alistair, this is what I mean. Standards. They are the first thing to crumble. It's the small compromises that lead to ruin." Alistair Blackwood swirled the whiskey in his glass, his expression unreadable. "It's just an appetizer, Isolde." "It is never just an appetizer, Alistair," she snapped, her voice like the crack of a whip. "It is a reflection of a commitment to excellence, a commitment this waitress clearly fails to comprehend." Her venomous gaze returned to Ellie. "What was your name again?" "Eleanor, Mrs. Blackwood." "Eleanor," Isolde repeated, tasting the name as if it were poison. "Well, Eleanor, I suggest you learn the difference between excellence and mediocrity if you hope to have a future in this industry." The threat was explicit. The diners at the next table were now openly gawking. This was the Isolde Blackwood show, and they had front-row seats. Ellie held Isolde's gaze. She did not look down. She did not flinch. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you for the lesson, Mrs. Blackwood. I will ensure the remainder of your meal is beyond reproach." She took the plate and walked to the kitchen, her posture erect, her steps measured. She could feel every eye in the room on her back. Her composure was, in its own way, an act of profound defiance. Panic would have been a trophy for Isolde. An emotional collapse would have been a victory. This calm, professional absorption of the attack was something else, entirely. It was a refusal to validate the premise of the game. When she entered the kitchen, the executive chef, a burly man named Cormac, was already fuming. "Grade B! That woman has a palette of iron filings. I have the certificate of authenticity from the farm right here." "I know, chef," Ellie said quietly. "She isn't angry about the foie gras." For the rest of the meal, Isolde was icily silent toward Ellie, communicating only through clipped gestures. But Ellie noticed something new. Isolde kept glancing at her, a flicker of deep-seated irritation in her eyes. It was the look of a master manipulator whose subject had failed to react as programmed. She had pulled the strings, but the puppet had refused to dance. As they were preparing to leave, Alistair Blackwood paused beside Ellie as his wife swept ahead toward the door. He discreetly pressed a folded bill into her hand. It was crisp and felt like 100. "My apologies for that," he murmured, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "She's been under a great deal of pressure." Ellie watched them go, the folded bill a guilty weight in her palm. It wasn't pressure. It was a strategy. And Eleanor Vance, who had spent her life studying the difference between the authentic and the fraudulent, had just realized that Isolde Blackwood's power was built on the most fragile foundation of all: a lie. And Ellie, much to her own surprise, wasn't afraid. She was intrigued, and for a woman like Isolde Blackwood, that was infinitely more dangerous. The encounter with Isolde lit a quiet, methodical fire in Ellie. It wasn't about revenge, it was about professional curiosity. In her former life, her father had taught her that the most beautiful forgeries often hide the most fascinating stories of desperation and ambition. Isolde Blackwood was the most complex forgery she had ever encountered, and Ellie felt an irresistible urge to trace her provenance. Her investigation began not with databases, but with the living archives of the Meridian, the staff. In the cramped break room during the lulls between lunch and dinner service, she listened. The stories poured out, a litany of petty cruelties that, when pieced together, formed a distinct pattern. Remember when she claimed the scent of the hostess's perfume was aggressively plebeian and made Henderson send the girl home to shower, one waiter recounted. What about the time she insisted the valet repark her car 3 times because the front tires weren't perfectly aligned with the painted line, another added. Each story centered on an obsession with a very specific, theatrical performance of old money perfection. The perfume, the tires, the foie gras, they were all props in her personal drama. Any deviation from her script was met with a rage that was entirely disproportionate to the offense. To Ellie, this didn't signal strength. It signaled a profound, deep-seated insecurity. Marcus, the bartender, became her most crucial source. One rain-slicked Tuesday night, as the restaurant hummed with a quiet murmur, Ellie leaned against the polished bar. "Marcus, you've been here the longest. What was she like when she and Alistair first started coming in?" Marcus paused, wiping down a copper mug. "Different," he said, his voice low, trying to be the same, but you could see the effort. This was right after they married, maybe 10 years ago. She was watchful, nervous, always looking at the other society wives, copying how they held their wine glasses, how they pronounced the French dishes. She was learning a role. And Alistair? He was a man in love. His first wife's passing hit him hard. He was lonely for years. Then Isolde came along, beautiful, intelligent, seemingly perfect. He didn't see the machinery whirring beneath the surface, or maybe he didn't want to. Marcus leaned in a little closer. The strange thing is, nobody knew her before him. One day, the society pages announced that Alistair Blackwood was engaged to the enigmatic Isolde de la Cour from a distinguished European family. Before that day, it's like she didn't exist. I've served every old money family in this city for 30 years. The Saltonstalls, the Cabots, the Lowells. No one had ever heard of the de la Cours. A woman with no past. It wasn't just a red flag. It was a gaping hole in the canvas. That night, Ellie went home to her small apartment, the $100 bill from Alistair still tucked into a drawer. It felt like evidence. She opened her laptop, the keys worn smooth from years of research. She started with public records, searching for Isolde de la Cour. The results were suspiciously thin. A few mentions in philanthropic journals, always tied to her husband's donations, and society pages that repeated the same vague, polished biography. There were no birth records, no university enrollments, no digital footprint at all before her marriage. It was as if she had been born the day she met Alistair Blackwood. Ellie changed tactics. She began to focus on the objects, the props in Isolde's performance. She started with the emerald ring. Using her old industry contacts, she sent a discreetly worded email to a gemologist friend in New York, attaching a high-resolution press photo of Isolde wearing the ring. "Curious about this piece," she wrote. "Supposed to be 16th century Florentine. What do you think?" The reply came 2 days later. "Ellie, good to hear from you. The ring? It's a famous fake, a known quantity. It's called the Blackwood Emerald in certain circles. The setting is a masterpiece of modern craftsmanship, aged artificially. The stone is a Chatham emerald, lab-grown, beautiful, but worth a tiny fraction of what a real one would be. The story is that Alistair Blackwood bought it at a charity auction years ago, believing it to be real. He paid a fortune. Whoever sold it to him was a brilliant con artist. He was deeply embarrassed by the affair and has never spoken of it publicly." Ellie's blood ran cold. Alistair knew. He knew his wife wore a famous fake on her finger every day. Why? Was he protecting her, or was he a willing participant in the deception? This new information shifted everything. The con wasn't just Isolde's. It was a shared secret, a foundational lie at the heart of their marriage. Ellie started digging into charity auction records from around the time Alistair would have bought the ring, roughly 12 years ago. She cross-referenced them with events he attended in the year leading up to his marriage. She spent hours scrolling through old guest lists and event photos. And then she found it. It wasn't a name, but a face. In the background of a blurry photo from a Palm Beach charity gala, standing behind a potted palm, was a woman. She was younger, her hair a different color, but the bone structure was unmistakable. The sharp jawline, the high cheekbones, the same cold, determined eyes. She was talking to a known art dealer, a man named Julian Croft, who had a reputation for dealing in objects with questionable provenance. The woman in the photo was not listed in the caption. She was a ghost. Ellie's hands trembled. This was it. This was the anachronism. This was the woman before she became Isolde. She began a new, frantic search, this time for Julian Croft. She found articles about his sudden disappearance from the art world about a decade ago, following a scandal involving the sale of forged old master drawings to a Texas oil tycoon. Croft had vanished before he could be charged. The articles mentioned he often worked with a beautiful, charismatic female associate who acted as his front, charming potential buyers. She was described as a chameleon, able to adopt any accent or backstory required. She was known in those circles only by a nickname, the Magpie, for her ability to spot and acquire beautiful, shiny things. Ellie leaned back, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. The girl in the photo, the Magpie, had conned Alistair Blackwood with the emerald ring. But instead of being arrested, she had accomplished the greatest con of her career. She hadn't just sold him a fake jewel, she had sold him a fake life, a fake identity. She had sold him herself, and Alistair, either blinded by love or trapped by the public humiliation of it all, had accepted the deal. He had married his own con artist. The cruelty, the obsession with perfection, the constant performance. It all made sense now. It was the desperate, unending work of a master forger, terrified that one day an expert would walk into the room, look too closely, and see the truth. Ellie now held a truth so explosive it could shatter not just one woman's life, but the foundations of one of the city's most powerful families. The question was no longer about authenticating the forgery. The question was what she was going to do with the truth. The discovery of Isolde's past as the Magpie was a dangerous secret. Ellie knew that a direct confrontation would be disastrous. This wasn't a simple bully. This was a professional grifter who had built an empire on lies. A direct attack would be met with overwhelming force. For now, she held the knowledge like a hidden card, continuing her shifts at the Meridian with the same unnerving professionalism. Her composure, however, was having a corrosive effect on Isolde. Ellie's refusal to be broken was an intolerable act of defiance. It was a mirror Isolde could not bear to look into. If she could not shatter the Waitress with psychological warfare, she would have to escalate. She would have to orchestrate her complete and utter ruin. The assault came on a glittering Saturday night in early December. The Meridian was at its festive peak, filled with Boston's Brahmin and tech royalty. The Blackwoods were at Table 1, hosting a state senator and his wife. Isolde was a vision in winter white, the infamous sapphire brooch glittering at her shoulder. She was playing the part of the gracious hostess to perfection. But Ellie, now fluent in her tells, could see the predatory stillness in her eyes every time she looked in her direction. She was a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. The moment came just as dessert was being served. Isolde let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, her hand flying to her shoulder where the brooch had been pinned. "Oh, my heavens!" she cried, her voice a perfect pitch of manufactured panic. "It's gone." Alistair turned to her, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. "What's gone, darling?" "My brooch!" she exclaimed, her voice rising to command the attention of the entire dining room. "The Blackwood sapphire! It's gone!" A wave of shock rippled through the nearby tables. The Blackwood sapphire wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a legendary heirloom, part of the Blackwood family collection for over a century. Its value was astronomical, but its historical significance was priceless. Isolde stood up, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief. "It was here. I know it was. I touched it just before the Waitress cleared the main course plates." Her gaze, as sharp and cold as a diamond drill, locked onto Ellie. "You, the Waitress. Eleanor. You were standing right here. You leaned in close to clear my husband's plate." The accusation, implicit but unmistakable, hung in the suddenly silent room. Ellie felt a wave of cold dread, but her appraiser's mind took over. Assess the object, analyze the performance, find the flaw. "Mrs. Blackwood," Ellie said, her voice miraculously steady despite the furious pounding in her chest, "I assure you I saw no brooch." "Of course you would say that," the senator's wife chimed in, eager to play a supporting role in the drama. "It could have fallen onto a plate, and you simply swept it away into the kitchen." The room was buzzing. Mr. Henderson rushed over, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Mrs. Blackwood, what is the matter?" "The matter, Henderson," Isolde said, pointing a trembling finger at Ellie, "is that the Blackwood sapphire has vanished, and your waitress was the last person near me. I want her searched. I want the kitchen bins emptied. I want that brooch found." This was the checkmate. It was a public branding. In this world, the word of Isolde Blackwood was gospel. The word of a waitress was dust. Ellie would be fired, her reputation annihilated. The accusation of stealing a historic artifact would be a professional death sentence, following her for the rest of her life. Mr. Henderson looked at Ellie, his eyes a mixture of terror and pleading. "Eleanor, did you see anything?" "No, sir," Ellie said firmly. "I cleared the plates and took them straight to the kitchen." "Then search her apron," the senator's wife insisted. "That won't be necessary," Ellie said, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria. She looked directly at Mr. Henderson. "I will empty my pockets and my apron. I have nothing to hide." She calmly placed her server's notepad, a pen, and her tips from the evening onto a nearby service stand for all to see. Isolde let out a derisive scoff, "As if you'd be foolish enough to keep it on your person. It's in the kitchen, no doubt, hidden away, waiting for you to retrieve it after your shift." The trap was perfectly designed. The brooch was almost certainly tucked safely in Isolde's own evening bag. All that was needed was the accusation and the subsequent, fruitless search to seal Ellie's fate. "We will search the kitchen immediately," Mr. Henderson stammered, trying to placate her. "And what about her?" Isolde demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "She should be detained. The police should be called." Alistair Blackwood, who had been watching the scene with a pained, conflicted expression, finally spoke. "Isolde, let's be calm about this," he said, a note of deep weariness in his voice. "Perhaps it simply fell to the floor." "I have looked, Alistair. It is not here." The staff began a frantic, humiliating search on their hands and knees. Ellie stood motionless at the center of the storm, the accused. She knew she couldn't prove she didn't have the brooch. Arguing was futile. She had to change the game entirely. She had to stop authenticating the forgery and start deconstructing it. Publicly. This was the moment. She had to deploy her weapon, not as a threat, but as a clinical, expert assessment. As the search proved fruitless and Mr. Henderson began to wring his hands, Isolde looked on with an expression of cold triumph. "Call the police, Henderson," she commanded. "I wish to file a report." For theft. The word hung in the air, a final damning nail in the coffin of Ellie's life. She took a slow, deep breath. She looked not at Isolde, but at the senator and his wife, at the other patrons who were watching, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and contempt. "The Blackwood sapphire," Ellie said, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant with a strange, sudden authority. "An extraordinary piece, a flawless, 80-carat cornflower blue sapphire, unheated, of Ceylon origin, set in platinum by Cartier in 1925, surrounded by 24 D-flawless diamonds, a truly priceless family heirloom." A confused silence fell over the room. No one had expected the accused waitress to give a history of the object she was accused of stealing. Isolde stared at her, a flicker of unease in her eyes. Ellie turned her gaze to Alistair Blackwood. A beautiful story, Mr. Blackwood. A beautiful legend. But the brooch Mrs. Blackwood was wearing tonight is not the Blackwood sapphire. A collective gasp swept the room. Alistair looked at her, stunned. What did you say? Ellie's voice was now calm, clinical, the voice of an expert delivering a difficult appraisal. The stone in Mrs. Blackwood's brooch is a Verneuil process synthetic sapphire. The cut is too perfect, with none of the subtle zoning or silk inclusions characteristic of a natural salon stone of that era. Furthermore, the setting, while beautiful, is not platinum. It's white gold with a rhodium plating, a common technique for high-end costume jewelry. The micropave work on the diamonds is modern, likely done with a laser, a technology that did not exist in 1925. She finally turned her gaze fully on Isolde, her eyes holding no malice, only the cold, hard certainty of fact. The brooch Mrs. Blackwood was wearing tonight is a replica. The silence that fell was not empty. It was a dense, physical presence, a vacuum created by the sudden and total evaporation of a decade of power. It pressed in on the airs, heavy with the weight of 100 unspoken thoughts. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy was a statue in a tableau of exquisite social death. The only movement was the frantic, useless glitter of the replica brooch lying on the white linen, a cheap star fallen from a counterfeit heaven. Isolde's face was no longer a mask of fury. It was the ruin of one. The carefully constructed planes of her beauty seemed to shift and collapse, revealing the raw, terrified architecture beneath. The color had fled, leaving a waxy, translucent pallor, the skin of a creature that had lived its entire life in the dark and was now dragged, blinking and naked, into the sun. This was a wound her cruelty could not cauterize, a humiliation her wealth could not erase. Eleanor had not merely accused her, she had professionally unmade her, deconstructing her piece by piece in front of the very audience she had spent a lifetime cultivating. That's an outrageous lie! The words were a ghost of her former authority, thin and brittle, lacking the resonance of conviction. They shattered against the wall of Eleanor's unshakable factual calm. She was a queen without a kingdom, an actress on a dark stage, her lines forgotten. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, but it shifted from Isolde, a final, clinical dismissal. She turned it instead to Alistair Blackwood, and the cold precision in her voice softened, tempered by an unexpected, almost gentle grace. Mr. Blackwood, I am sure the real Blackwood sapphire is safe in a vault, where such an important piece should be. Perhaps Mrs. Blackwood wears the replica for security reasons, a very wise precaution. It was an act of profound, calculated mercy. She had exposed the forgery, but offered a new, more palatable narrative to replace it. She handed him a golden thread, a way to stitch the gaping wound in their public facade back together, to reframe the lie not as a deception, but as a secret shared between the powerful. It was an exit ramp from the highway of total annihilation. Alistair Blackwood stared at Eleanor, and in his eyes a storm was breaking. There was the initial shock, the deep, burning shame, but beneath it, a slow dawning and terrible clarity. He was a man waking from a long and opulent dream to find the silk sheets were merely painted canvas. He knew she was right. Of course he knew. He was the man who had bought the fake emerald, the first beautiful lie. He had spent the last 10 years as the curator of his own museum of forgeries, with his wife as the prized and most demanding exhibit. He turned his gaze to Isolde, to her panicked, crumbling face, and the spell of a decade shattered into a million pieces. He was no longer seeing the enigmatic European aristocrat, the flawless hostess, the goddess of ice and style. He was seeing Catherine O'Malley from Chicago. He was seeing the grifter. He was seeing the desperate, hungry ghost that had haunted every perfect dinner party, every flawless philanthropic gala. "Isolde," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all artifice, but it carried the immense gravity of a final judgment. "Where is the brooch?" Her name, spoken with that deadened finality, was the true blow. Her eyes, burning with a hatred so pure it was incandescent, darted between her husband and the waitress. She was trapped in the wreckage of her own meticulous design. To admit she had the replica was to confess that her entire performance of aristocratic outrage was a pathetic farce over a piece of costume jewelry. Her power, her very identity, was built on the perception of unimpeachable taste and authenticity, to be revealed as not only a fraud, but a hysterical, foolish one. That was an extinction-level event. Her hands, trembling violently, reached into her small, beaded Fendi evening bag. The fine motor skills she had honed over a lifetime of elegant gestures failed her. She fumbled, a clumsy, desperate motion. Then she pulled it out. The glittering sapphire brooch. She held it aloft in her shaking hand, and under the unforgiving light of the Meridian's chandeliers, the synthetic stone seemed to mock her, its perfection suddenly looking garish, its fire cold and cheap. A collective intake of breath, a soft, sibilant wave of astonishment and pity and cruel delight washed through the dining room. The whispers began, no longer about a thieving waitress, but about the great Isolde Blackwood, the city's arbiter of elegance, who had just staged a public meltdown over a fake jewel that was in her own purse the entire time. The humiliation was a physical force. It was a poison, swift and absolute. Isolde did not scream. She did not weep. Such displays were for lesser women. Instead, she did the only thing a master forger can do when their work is exposed as worthless. She abandoned it. She let the brooch fall from her limp fingers. It landed on the tablecloth with a soft, final thud, a dead, glittering insect. She turned, her spine a rod of furious, brittle pride, and walked. She moved through the maze of tables, past the sea of staring, judging faces, her steps unnaturally even. She did not look back. She simply walked out of the Meridian, out of the life she had so painstakingly invented, and into the deafening silence she left in her wake. The walk from the door of the Meridian to the waiting town car was the longest journey of her life. The cold December air, usually a bracing affirmation of her existence, felt thin and suffocating, offering no purchase. Each familiar sound of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the tea beneath the street, the polite murmur of the valet, seemed alien, part of a world to which she no longer belonged. She saw her reflection in the polished black door of the car, but the woman staring back was a stranger. It wasn't Isolde Blackwood, the Empress. It was a ghost with her face, a hollowed-out thing with wide, terrified eyes. She got into the back seat, the soft leather feeling like sandpaper against her skin. As the car pulled silently away from the curb, she raised a trembling hand and touched her own cheekbone, the one Alistair had once called a triumph of aristocratic geometry. It felt cold, foreign, a mask. She closed her eyes, but the image of the waitress, calm, knowing, and utterly immovable, was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. The expert who had finally come to declare her a fake. Back in the restaurant, Alistair Blackwood remained standing at the table, a lonely monument in the center of the room. He looked down at the abandoned brooch, then over at Eleanor. His face was a landscape of profound, soul-crushing weariness. But in the depths of his eyes, a flicker of something long dormant had been rekindled, a reluctant, painful, dawning respect. He moved slowly, like a man decades older, reaching into his jacket for his wallet. He pulled out a black, featureless credit card and placed it on the table to settle the bill for a meal that had cost him far more than money. He then turned to face Eleanor fully. "I believe," he said, his voice raspy with unspoken history, "that I owe you an apology of such magnitude that I don't know where to begin." Mr. Henderson stood nearby, his jaw slack, his carefully ordered world completely upended. Behind the bar, Marcus, who had witnessed 30 years of the city's secrets, slowly, deliberately, picked up a single glass and began to polish it, a wide, slow grin spreading across his face. It was the grin of a man who had just seen justice served, not hot and fast, but cold, patient, and exquisitely precise. Eleanor simply took a deep, steadying breath. The adrenaline that had sustained her, that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice, was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. She had not just faced the lioness, she had authenticated her, catalogued her flaws, and written the final, damning entry on her provenance. In the silent, brutal museum of Isolde Blackwood's world, to be made a fool was a fate infinitely worse than death. The weeks that followed were defined by a profound quiet. The legend of that night rippled through the city's elite circles, whispered over cocktails at the Somerset Club, and dissected during board meetings in the financial district. The story was too delicious, too perfect in its symmetry. The untouchable queen of society, undone by a quiet waitress who saw the world not with deference, but with the cold, clear eye of an appraiser. Isolde Blackwood vanished. There was no messy divorce announcement in the papers, no public statement. She simply ceased to be. Table 1 at the Meridian remained empty, a velvet-lined ghost, a silent testament to the fragility of fear-based empires. The atmosphere in the restaurant underwent a subtle chemical change. The oppressive tension, the feeling of walking on eggshells, slowly lifted. It was replaced by something lighter, more genuine. The staff breathed easier. Eleanor continued her shifts, a silent celebrity in her own workplace. She was treated with a new kind of reverence, a mixture of awe and gratitude. She deflected the questions and praise with the same quiet professionalism she had shown on the night of the incident. Inwardly, however, she felt a seismic shift. She had spent months feeling like a ghost herself, adrift from her past, her skills rendered useless. But in that hushed, crystal-lit dining room, she had discovered that her father's lessons, to look closer, to question the perfect surface, to understand the story an object is trying to tell, were not just tools for appraising art. They were a way of navigating the world. They were her power. 2 weeks to the day after Isolde's exit, a courier delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope to her small apartment. The paper was heavy, expensive, with a simple embossed B at the top. The note inside was handwritten in a precise, elegant script. "Miss Vance, I have a matter of some delicacy and importance I wish to discuss with you. I would be grateful if you would meet me. A car will be waiting for you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Alistair Blackwood." The car was a silent, dark grey Bentley that smelled of wealth so old it had become subtle. It did not take her to an office or a restaurant, but wound its way through the gaslit streets of Beacon Hill, stopping before a stately, federal-style mansion of old brick and ivy. Alistair Blackwood himself opened the door. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the crushing weariness had been replaced by a somber clarity. He had the look of a man who had survived a devastating shipwreck and was now taking his first steps on solid ground. He led her into a library that was the room Eleanor had always dreamed of. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with the warm, chaotic spines of centuries of books. The air smelled of old paper, leather, beeswax, and a faint, lingering trace of regret. "Thank you for coming, Miss Vance," he began, gesturing to a deep leather armchair by a cold fireplace. I felt this conversation was best had in private. He sat opposite her, a slim file folder on the mahogany table between them. "I have spent the last 14 days in a state of reckoning. I had your appraisal of the brooch confirmed. You were correct, of course. Down to the last detail. The Verneuil process, the rhodium plating. A perfect assessment." Eleanor simply nodded, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "I also," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "did what I should have done 10 years ago. I hired a team of very discreet, very thorough investigators to trace the provenance of the woman I married." He pushed the folder gently across the table toward her. "They found Catherine O'Malley. They found the Magpie. They found the entire, sordid, brilliant story. I suspect it contains little you do not already know. But I felt you, as the one who closed the file, so to speak, should have a copy. A professional courtesy." He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a decade of self-deception leaving his body. "I was not just a fool who bought a fake emerald, Miss Vance. I was a willing participant. After my first wife died, I was adrift, lonely. And then Catherine arrived. She was a masterpiece. She was everything society expected, everything I thought I wanted. Perfect, polished, without any of the messy, inconvenient needs of a real person. When I discovered the truth about the ring, months into our marriage, I was faced with a choice: expose the forgery and endure the cataclysmic humiliation, or accept it, curate it, protect it. I chose the easier path. I chose to live with the beautiful fake, because it was less complicated than the truth." He looked at her, his gaze direct and stripped of all pretense. "What you did in that restaurant, you didn't just expose a piece of costume jewelry, you held up a mirror, and you forced me to see the truth of the entire collection. She's gone. I helped her disappear. It was the last service I could perform for the woman I thought I married." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "What I cannot fathom is, how? I understand your expertise with objects, but her entire being, how did you know to look so closely at her?" Eleanor thought of her father, his hands dusted with the fine powder of ages, holding a piece of silver up to the light. "My father taught me that the most convincing forgeries always betray themselves with their perfection," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Authentic things, Mr. Blackwood, whether they are people or antiques, have flaws. They have a history. They have nicks and scratches and repairs. The patina of living. Isolde, she had no patina. She was flawless, brand new. She was a story without a past, and stories without a past are always fictions." Alistair Blackwood stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, but as the formidable expert she was. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "My family has been collecting for generations. Art, antiques, jewelry. It is a significant collection, managed for years by curators who, I now realize, were more adept at flattery than authentication. I find myself the proprietor of a life's worth of beautiful things, and I no longer know which of them are real." He gestured around the magnificent room, at the paintings on the walls, the sculptures on the mantels. I need a new chief curator. Someone whose only allegiance is to the truth. Someone with an incorruptible eye, a deep knowledge of history, and the courage to tell a powerful man that he has been a fool. It is a monumental task, an authentication of an entire legacy. He looked directly at her, the question clear in his eyes before he even spoke it. It is a world away from the meridian, I know, but I have a feeling you are uniquely, perhaps singularly qualified, Miss Vance. Would you be interested? Eleanor looked at the file folder containing the ghost of Catherine O'Malley, then at the broken, powerful man in front of her. She thought of her father's shuttered business, of her own grief and desperation. She had been forced into a world designed to render her invisible. But in that world, she had found herself. She had discovered that the legacy her father had given her was not a shop on Newbury Street. It was a way of seeing. It was a form of power. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, the first in a very long time. It was not a smile of triumph, but of purpose. It was the smile of an expert who has just been presented with the most complex, challenging, and fascinating commission of her life. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady as she reached for the file. "I would be honored to oversee your collection. I think I know exactly where to start."